The Callisto Protocol is an upcoming sci-fi survival horror set in the distant future taking place in outer space. Now, if this sounds familiar, it's because it's the same tagline that could be used for Dead Space. The big difference this time around is that the Callisto Protocol is being developed by Glen Schofield, who is the creator and director of Dead Space. The Callisto Protocol seems like where Glen Schofield wanted the Dead Space series to go before he left EA for other endeavors, which would technically make this game the spiritual successor, which in my opinion would include either the same studio or a bunch of the same staff that have departed to another studio or formed their own, which is I think what we have now with striking distance, as many have worked either on Dead Space 1, 2, or both. I may have blinders on as I am already all in on the Callisto Protocol, with Dead Space being somewhere in my top 10 games of all time, and to get a better idea for the chances of success, let's take a look back at 5 of the more notable spiritual successors in gaming to determine if history is on the side of Callisto Protocol or not. Mega Man slowed down from the ultra-fast release pace of the 1980s and the 1990s after the release of Mega Man 8 in 1996. It wasn't until 2008 when Mega Man 9 was released, and it was also the first game in the series to not have a physical release upon launch. In 2013, KJ Inafune, illustrator and co-designer of Mega Man, launched a Kickstarter for Mighty No. 9 with a goal of 900,000 that was reached in just a few days, as many had fond memories for the early days of the Blue Bomber. By the time all the public funding phases were over, the game had raised over $4 million. Unfortunately, after many delays, the game finally released in June 2016 for some platforms to very underwhelming reviews of around 50%, as the most common thread was that it was buggy and uninspired. Ken Levine and Irrational Games seemed ahead of their time with System Shock 2. It combined many genres into one, including first-person shooters, survival horror, and RPG. System Shock 2 was a critical success that many outlets consider to be one of the best games of all time, but commercial success was missing. This changed in 2007 when Irrational Games released the spiritual successor, Bioshock. It featured many of the same themes and mechanics, and this time around, Bioshock was a smash across the board, with a 95 review average, sales of over 2.2 million in the first year, and 2 sequels since, with a third in development. When Koji Igarashi left Konami in 2014, he wanted to make more games in the vein of Castlevania's Symphony of the Night. Like many others on this list, Bloodstained Ritual of the Night turned to the fans who loved the series and raised over $5.5 million on Kickstarter, with one of the stretch goals including a prelude that would become Bloodstained Curse of the Moon, which would also spawn another sequel. Bloodstained was a big success with a review average of around 83, and in 2020, the studio announced that the sales had passed 1 million. In 2009, Demon's Souls came out for the PlayStation 3 and began the slow mass acceptance of From Software games that would eventually reach a climax with Elden Ring. However, since Demon's Souls was a Sony IP and the studio wanted to continue with the formula, From Software created the spiritual successor, Dark Souls, so that it could be released on other platforms. To no surprise, Dark Souls continued to evolve the formula that proved popular with Demon's Souls, with punishing gameplay and imaginative worlds. Reviews floated around 90, and the studio announced that in under 2 years, Dark Souls had sold over 2.37 million units, and it also led to Dark Souls 2 and 3, which were also big hits as well. Public funding seems to be the theme for spiritual successors. Playtonic was formed by many former Rare developers and raised over £2 million for the spiritual successor to Banjo-Kazooie from the N64. While Yooka-Laylee felt like a banjo game from the 90s, many critics felt that the game failed to modernize the formula. Reviews only averaged around 73, but it did enough to warrant a 2D side-scrolling sequel that would release a few years later to much better reviews, averaging around an 82. The chances of success appear to be typically high when looking at the precedent of spiritual successors in gaming. When looking at these examples, 4 out of the 5 are considered big successes with strong sales and sequels, and this leads me to the theory that gamers want something very similar to what they once loved. While this isn't a scientific method, history has a tendency to repeat itself, and the Callisto Protocol looks to have history on its side.